Alaska, north of the Arctic Circle. Not the sort of place where anyone would choose to live or work unless they had powerful reasons for doing so. Until very recently, it was an empty, icy wasteland. Now it's still a wilderness, but it's not quite so deserted. Things are changing in Alaska, and a new breed of men is replacing the few Eskimos who once lived here. And where the Eskimos existed from hand to mouth, these men work for wages a prime minister might envy, well over $1,000 a week for skilled men. They're oil workers, part of a boom that could make the Alaskan gold rush of 70 years ago look like a scramble for pennies. Alaska's first commercial oil well was struck in 1907, but it wasn't until the 1950s that major fields were discovered. The first finds were in the south, on the Kenai Peninsula, but the really big one was here, at Prudhoe Bay on Alaska's north coast. Oilmen know for sure it contains nearly 10,000 million barrels of oil and 20 million cubic feet of gas. A bonanza indeed in these days of energy crisis. Although this is America's biggest ever oil find, only about half is owned by American oil companies. The other half belongs to the American subsidiary of BP, a company in which the British government holds a controlling interest. So at least some of the profits will go to join those Britain hopes to make out of its North Sea reserves. American oilmen are glad the field's so big, but even they would have been grateful for something a little more accessible. Alaska's a long way from the rest of the United States, and Prudhoe Bay itself is 200 miles inside the Arctic Circle. The base camps are islands of civilization in the middle of nowhere. This one, belonging to an American oil consortium, taps local gas for power, a nearby river for water, and has everything from its own theater to the most modern sewage plant in Alaska. The camp's lifeline to the outside world is of course the airfield, which handles all passenger traffic and all but the heaviest freight. And despite the harsh conditions, women are included in the base's permanent workforce. When construction work reaches its peak, there'll be something like 1,000 people working in or near Prudhoe Bay. But once the field achieves regular production, the figure's more likely to be 300. For employees of the British company, home will be here, in a building which provides much more than just shelter from the Arctic winds. These trees, the only ones for hundreds of miles around, are maintained artificially at enormous expense, simply to help the workforce feel at home. No rough canteen here, but a dining room any hotel would be proud of. The presence of women adds a further touch of normality. There are 20 at the moment, and they earn the same money as the men for equal work. Most men want the highly paid jobs out on the fields, so security guards aren't easy to find. With all this luxury, it's not surprising the building's become known as the BP Hilton, and it's certainly more like an hotel than a company headquarters. But there's only room for a couple of hundred here, mostly managers and supervisors, so there's a certain amount of jealousy among the rest of the workforce. Another reason for envy, alcohol's generally forbidden in the camps. This bar's an exception. Sporting facilities are limited by space, but there's a pool room, as well as a different kind of pool, which also serves as a reservoir in case of fire. There's even a small sports field, complete with plastic turf. It all makes a welcome change from conditions outside, where it gets so cold that drivers leave their engines running rather than risk being unable to restart. The weather's a major factor in transporting supplies. Most come by plane, but large items like this have to come in during the brief Arctic summer, when the ice moves sufficiently offshore to allow barges in from Seattle. Moving supplies is one thing, moving the oil is quite another. The sea passage just isn't feasible all year round, so the companies are building a pipeline to carry it right across Alaska, nearly 800 miles, down to the southern port of Valdez. These are just a few of the 69,000 lengths of steel tubing that will make up the pipeline. Each one's 40 feet long and 4 feet across, with a wall thickness of roughly ½ an inch, and every one was made in Japan. Total cost, $120 million US. The pipeline's been the hot potato of the whole Alaskan oil venture. Objections by environmentalists held up the project for nearly 5 years, and it wasn't until January of last year that it finally got the go-ahead. Arctic temperatures mean the tubes have to be thawed out before welding can even begin. After thawing, the tubes are welded into 80-foot sections, then transported to the site for welding into the pipeline. The engineer's task hasn't been easy, for this is some of the most varied and difficult terrain in the world. The pipe will cross 3 mountain ranges, and there's a permanent threat of damage by earthquakes. Safety precautions are elaborate, and if it does spring a leak, computer-controlled circuits will come into action immediately to keep damage to the absolute minimum. By far the safest place for the pipe is underground, and just over half its length will be buried. The rest of the pipe is on stilts. Machines like this drill the holes for them. The pace of work on the pipeline's been steadily increasing over the last 12 months. By August this year, there'll be 16,000 men working on it. It took years of geological surveys to find the safest route across Alaska's surface, which ranges from fragile, easily melted permafrost to stable soil and rock. The above-ground sections are needed in areas where the hot oil in the pipeline would melt the permafrost. Actually laying the pipeline was expected to cost $900 million, but the 5-year delay escalated costs enormously, and the current estimate for the job is $6,000 million. The oilmen say that makes it not only the largest civil engineering project in history, but also the most expensive. Oil's brought wealth to Alaska, but also many problems. Attracted by the industry's high wages, men have come pouring into oil towns like Fairbanks, only to find that every job has several applicants, with preference given to local people. Unemployment generally is over 15%, and the crime rate's rising. For those with jobs, there's no shortage of places to spend their money. Like the early gold rush towns, Fairbanks has sprouted dozens of bars and nightclubs, all out to get their share of the oil bonanza.
Oh my God. Anyway, we're glad you're all...
With the boom still in its infancy, the level of entertainment's still a long way behind Las Vegas.
Remember, we have dancing from 4:30, from 9 o'clock until 4:30 in the morning. So with a warm welcome right now, let's bring to the stage, if you will, from Seattle. She's living in Seattle now. She's from Israel. Let's welcome, if you will, Ziona, ladies and gentlemen. Let's hear it for Ziona. Let's hear it for Ziona. Thank you.
This Israeli-born dancer's making a good living, but the real money for a girl in the oil towns is in prostitution. Girls can claim up to $400 per client, and officials admit that vice activity has soared and is getting increasingly difficult to control. The workers themselves are simply out to enjoy themselves and relax after the rigors of the oil fields. But their spending power is so enormous that a whole army of confidence tricksters is already moving in on them. Alaska's Assistant Attorney General, Stan Howitt, fears the workers are merely sitting ducks for the swindlers.
They are extremely attractive. I think they are easy targets because they're making so much money they don't mind throwing off a few $100s a week in order to go into some job opportunity scheme, an investment scheme of that sort.
And how extensive is this sort of con merchant trick in the pipeline camps?
Well, truthfully, at the present time, we're trying to ascertain that, and we've just made contact with Alaska, hoping to do a fraud program up into each and every area.
How serious do you think the situation could become if nothing's done?
I think it could become very serious, very deadly serious, because the money is there.
Having crossed the northern mountains, the pipeline moves steadily southwards, slicing through Alaska's once virgin forests. Here at Rampart Canyon, the pipeline engineers will become the first men to bridge the mighty Yukon. The bridge will carry road traffic as well as the pipeline and will transform communications in the area. A project of this size simply can't be carried through without damage to the environment. But after facing such determined opposition from environmentalists, the oil men claim they have done everything possible to preserve what is, after all, one of the world's last great wildernesses. This is where the pipeline will end up, at the port of Valdez. The terminal to be built here will eventually be able to handle 2 million barrels of oil a day. The port is ice-free all the year round. The oil will be loaded onto tankers and shipped out to America's power-hungry west coast. The first consignment's due to move in 1977, and from then on, the black gold from Prudhoe Bay will make Americans increasingly thankful for that day back in 1867, when they bought Alaska from Russia for just 2 cents an acre.